And you all know that you're invited this year to the ordination, where, God willing and the creek don't rise, we will have a new rabbi among the Jewish people who has worked really, really hard and has earned it. So make a point to join us for that. Two things to say. The first is, if you're looking for ways to do easy learning, you can go to zieglertorah.org, where we have podcasts. That's recorded teachings of mine, of Reb Mimi Feigelson, of Aaron Alexander, of Rabbi Elliot Dorff, a great range of teachings, so you can use it if you're in your car driving from place to place, if you're jogging or walking or whatever. And they're always about an hour more or less in length, so that's a good way to clock in those 18,000 hours if you'd like. And also, I will clue you in, one of the funnest things on the Jewish internet, we do a once-a-month Q&A with the rabbinical students, in which they get to decide what the topics are. And then I have to spontaneously respond to the topics. I'm told by people that those are endlessly amusing. So you might want to avail yourself of those to know what goes on in the minds of the people who will be doing the early and late service 10 years from now. So what we're going to learn now is one of my favorite discoveries in the Talmud. About 2 cycles ago, I did DaFiomi. DaFiomi is an international program where if you do a daf, that's 2 sides of the page of Talmud every day, without exception. That means on Yom Kippur, on Tisha B'Av, every day of the week. But if you continue at 2 pages, 2 sides a day, you'll finish the entire Talmud in about 8 years. So, and it's a commitment. It's a commitment. But I decided, having been a rabbi for 10 years at the time, that it was time to have read the entire Talmud Bavli. And the great thing about doing that is you discover things that no one had ever taught you before, or things that didn't attract someone else's attention. This is one of those treasures. The minute I saw it, I knew I had to teach it. It's really incredible. So what we're going to be looking at is a story in the Talmud involving Alexander the Great, his trip to Africa, and his learning from the African warrior women somewhere in sub-Saharan Africa, and what lessons of life he derives from those women. It seems especially appropriate since we have the husband of one of the African warrior women with us at the present. And I know Tzipora, so that was not just a random comment. I have been to deepest, darkest Africa. Had a great time there. It was an amazing experience. I encourage all of you at some point to make a trip to Uganda. Really incredible. I had the pleasure of accompanying your rabbi and supervising all of the Brit Milah that he participated in. And I can't tell you the stories about him up here because it's a synagogue and you can't use those words in here. So here we go. Now, as we did last night, for those of you who were here last night, we're going to do a close literary read of this story. So you need to pay attention to how the author of the story is shaping it, what choices that he makes by what's included, what's not included, what he draws our attention to dope out what the story is about. And of course, a good place to begin is the beginning. Alexander of Macedon put 10 questions to the elders of the South County. So I'm going to ask you, what stands out in that first sentence? If you had to pick a word or two that weren't absolutely necessary, what might be not necessary? South Country. So you could not know where the sages are, possibly. Good enough. And the South Country is the Negev. Right, so this is telling us that Alexander the Great is doing his world tour. It's kind of like when Madonna does a world tour, except less people die. So he's doing a tour. Okay, what else might be unnecessary in this sentence? Of Macedon, right? So what is the author tipping us off to by going out of his way to identify Alexander as of Macedon? All right, so one thing we know he's not Jewish, although let me ask you an honest question. Was there anyone in the ancient world who didn't know that Alexander was a goy? Right? Alexander was the most famous Gentile of the ancient world. I understand, but that doesn't make him Jewish. Latinos have taken the name Jesus. That doesn't make him... some anonymous Alexander. Alexander the Schlemazel. Correct. Okay, so one way is just to make sure we know we're talking about the Alexander, but I still want to push you on that. What does it mean to know that he's of Macedon?
They don't give him a title.
Correct. They don't give him a title. So two things you need to derive from that. The first is, in Western culture, the way you get the name the Great is if you take away someone else's land and you murder a lot of innocent people. All right, so if you go through Western history, everyone who is so-and-so the Great, Herod the Great, Catherine the Great, Peter the Great, what links them all, they're the Great because they took stuff that didn't belong to them and they killed people in the process. We don't consider that a source of greatness, so he's never in Jewish literature Alexander the Great. But notice that what they identify is that he's of a place. He's of a place, and that's what the story is going to be about. It's going to be about what does it mean to come from somewhere and to be from somewhere, right? And that's particularly important with Alexander because Alexander spent his entire life running away from Macedon, right? He's the guy who keeps trying to conquer new worlds all the time. So the fact that they label him not as Alexander the Conqueror, Alexander the King, Alexander the guy who had the biggest empire in the ancient world before Rome, no, he's Alexander of Macedon, because this is a story about knowing your place, literally. Right? And it starts in southern Israel, where he's meeting with some sages. Yeah. This story, it's hard always to answer that question about the Talmud because unlike modern literature where the date in the front of the book tells you when it was first printed, the Talmud's dates tell you when it was finally redacted, which means it's much older than that. So there's no way to accurately date this except to assume that because it's in Aramaic and it's not part of the Mishnah, that it's taking place a good 500 years after Alexander, which means that in all likelihood, there's no actual Alexander the Great used in the creation of this story. All right, you should not assume that this story is a matter of history. Every ancient Near Eastern culture has an Alexander visited our sages and learned something story, right? And it's not especially credible. Right? My favorite ancient version of that, by the way, since I'm a philosopher, is that there were stories in the ancient synagogue and in the early church that there were rabbis who fled Jerusalem and made it to Athens, and that's why Plato had what to teach, right? Because he obviously is a pagan, so he wouldn't have anything significant to teach. But obviously he and Aristotle studied from some anonymous rabbis fleeing Jerusalem, and that's why he has stuff that's of abiding value, and that's why it fits so nicely with Judaism and Christianity. That's among my favorite stories about the ancient Greeks. Okay, we ready to move on? Alexander asked them, which is further away, from heaven to earth or from east to west? And they replied, from east to west. The proof is that when the sun is in the east, everyone can look at it. And when it's in the west, everyone can look at it. But when the sun is in the middle of the sky, no one can look at it. And I want to stop here for a moment because that's going to require some translating. So he asks them an abstract question. Greeks like to do that. Right? So his abstract question is, which distance is greater? You stand on the Earth's surface and you look as far as you can that way to as far as you can that way. Is that the bigger distance? Or from here looking up, is that the bigger distance? Right? And what's the answer that they give? Meaning the horizontal distance is greater. How do we know this? right? So if you take a light bulb and you hold it really close to your face, you can't look at it. But if it's across the room, you're able to look at it just fine. And the fact is that when the sun is on the horizon, you're able to look at it just fine, but when it's straight up above, you can't look at it, right? That, by the way, is evident and it's correct, meaning their interpretation of what it means is wrong, but they're not wrong in noticing that the sun rising and setting you can look at, right? Whereas the noon sun you can't. So the first thing I want you to notice is that the rabbis are keen observers of nature. They don't have our theoretical explanations, they don't have our research tools, but they notice things like that about the world. Right? And the Talmud is littered with rabbinic observations about biology, about physics, about phenomenon. They may come up with why that is that we no longer accept, but that it is absolutely true and took someone really noticing. Okay, so their answer to him is from east to west is further away because you're able to look at the sun when it's on the horizon. Okay, so good enough. That's a good enough answer for Alexander, but not good enough for the sages. Because the sages argue and say, no, that's not true. The distance is the same. And then they quote a pasuk from Psalms. As heaven is high above the earth, so great is God's mercy towards them that fear him. As far as the east is from the west, so far has he removed our transgressions. Right? If one of these distances were greater, the text shouldn't write both, but only the one that is greater. So I have a question for you. Someone, in your own words, tell me, how do they dope out that the text implies it's the same distance? It compares the two, right? As great as A is, so great is B. That implies that A and B are the same. Okay? Now, when the sages of the Negev were talking to Alexander, they didn't quote a verse. But when the sages start to argue with each other, they don't cite astronomical evidence, they quote a verse. Why? Yeah.
Well, I want to ask a question that predates the question you just asked, which is the assumption that it's the same group of people. In the first sentence, he's talking about the elders.
Correct. So the sages are not the elders. The sages are the sages. Meaning we're now talking about higher up rabbis. And they're telling the elders, bad answer. Okay? And they're quoting a pasuk. So, but my question remains the same. Why do the sages not give the elders some astronomical data? Why instead do they quote a verse? I want to encourage people who haven't yet spoken, and I want to encourage all of us to pretend that we're Gentiles, which means we raise our hands prior to opening our mouths, and then only after we're called upon do we then open our mouths. Let's all practice that today. It's a useful social skill to have out in the world. Okay, so the Hebrew word for heaven is Shamayim, which happens to be the Hebrew word for sky. So anytime you see the word heaven in a prayer book, in a Talmud, in a Bible, you're equally available to translate it as sky. Okay? And in this case, we're talking about the sky. Right? And heaven is not a mythic place. It's Beverly Hills adjacent. Yes.
Isn't it that the sages, that's what they are? They're rabbinic sages. Their point and purpose in that community is to enlighten.
So why didn't they do that with Alexander? Why didn't they give him a verse?
Because he's not part of that community.
Exactly. Right? So you can't prove an argument by quoting a text if people who you're quoting it to haven't already accepted its authority. Right? If a Christian knocks on my door and wants to prove to me that I'm going to go to hell if I don't accept Jesus, quoting from the Gospel of John won't be a very effective technique. because I don't accept the authority of the Gospel of John. If a Christian is arguing with another Christian, then the Gospel of John trumps logic, right? Because the position they're taking here, and it's a reasonable one, is when you talk to a non-Jew, you have to use logic and science, which are not culturally limited. But when you talk to someone who's a member of the tribe, then if you quote a pasuk, that's more authoritative than reason. Why? Why, if there's a conflict between reason and Scripture, does Scripture trump inside? Yeah. Because we have buy-in. They're not interested in your consensus. They think it's actually true in the other case, it's just not effective. What I want to know is, if you see a conflict between your experience and Scripture, the rabbis say, go with Scripture. Why? Who's the author of Scripture? God. Right? So in a conflict between the way you figured out something and the way God figured out something, and I mean no offense by this, God trumps. Right? So that's why when the sages argue with each other, they quote a verse. But now we've got a problem. They've now shown that the reason given by the Negev elders is wrong. We know that from the pasuk. But the phenomenon is still real. It is nonetheless true that when you look at the horizon, you can look at the sun, and when you look at the noonday sky, you can't. So now the remaining problem is a scientific one, which is, well, if that's true, why is it? And look at their answer. It's brilliant. What's the reason why no one can look at the sun when it's in the middle of the sky? Because it is absolutely clear and nothing obstructs the view. I just want to tell you that is scientifically accurate. Oh, yes. Because picture the curve of the earth and the atmosphere looks like this. Everyone got that? I'm not allowed to write because you're rabbis here. So like this. Okay? And if you're standing on the surface of the earth and you look at the horizon, you're looking through all of that atmosphere before you get to open space, right? Whereas if you look up, you've only got this much atmosphere to look through. The reason why the noonday sun looks so much brighter than the horizon sun is because the thickness of the atmosphere both distorts it and screens it. You noticed this past month when the full moon came up, when it was right on the horizon, it looked gigantic. That's because the atmosphere becomes a magnifying lens, right? And it expands its image and it turns it blood orange, right? So their answer is not wrong. Notice that what they're saying is that they're very good observers, right? They really notice the world around them. Okay, but now we go back to Alexander, and he's still trying to have a conversation with the sages. Yes?
I tell you, I'm struck with the beauty of the second answer, because what the second answer brings out that the first one doesn't is the infinity of both. It's the infinite vastness from here to heaven. It's the same as the infinite vastness from east to west, because when does he stop becoming east and is now west?
Great. I guess my only qualification to that is it's vast but not infinite. Modern science does not believe we live in an infinite universe. I understand, but I don't think they think it's infinite either. I think God may be infinite, but I don't think they think that space is.
No, I know, but that's what I'm saying. I think the implication is that.
It's very big.
Is that you're saying he wasn't never.
Okay. Okay, we can belabor another point in a moment. So God says to them, and now Alexander goes back in conversation. He has another question. Which was created first, heaven or earth? And they answer, the heavens were created first, as it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now that I've finished the daily Talmud study, I've started a daily Zohar study, which is one wacky, awesome, great book. So I'll share with you one of the things from the introduction to the Zohar that I had never noticed before. The first two words of the Bible both start with the letter Bet, Bereshit, bara, and the second two words of the Bible both start with an aleph. Bereshit bara Elohim et. Right? Interesting thing, which is why the Zohar says that God created the world through the letters Bet and Aleph. All right, so they say, they give him an answer. Now the answer, notice, is based on a pasuk. Right? How do we know that the heavens are created first? What does this answer mean? How do we know that? Because it mentions it first. Right? Okay, good. So then he asks another question. Which is created first, light or darkness? And they say there's no answer to that. Now, what I'd like to ask you is it true that there's no answer to that?
What purpose would there be for light or if darkness did not come first?
That's fine. So you're saying there is an answer, but they're not giving it to Alexander. So you're accusing them of withholding an answer that they possess. Yes? Be gutsy. Be bold. Okay, she's accusing the sages of deliberately withholding an answer for Alexander. I'll ask our judges, is that correct? Yes, they indicate that that is exactly right. 3 points for Gryffindor. Why did they not reply that darkness was created first? Because the very same verse says the earth is unformed and void, and darkness, blah, 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 and then it says, let there be light, right? So if you know that heaven was created first because there's a biblical verse for it, the very next verse tells you that darkness is first. So why can't you give Alexander that answer? You already answered one of his questions. And the answer, at first they thought he just happened to ask the question. But when they saw that he pursued the subject, they realized that it's best not to answer him, because then he would go on to ask what's above and what's below and what's before and what's after. It is forbidden. You did learn something. It is forbidden. Greeks like to ask metaphysical, abstract questions all the time. They sit on their chaise lounges and they have young nubile people bring them grapes and various other delicacies, and they discuss metaphysical, abstract concepts. The rabbis prohibit it. And they don't prohibit it because the Greeks do it. They prohibit it because all we have available to ourselves is the world in front of us. And so abstract speculation is a waste of time. Your task is to make the world better, the part of it that comes to you, not to sit and think abstractly about whatever. And the symbol that they use for that is they ask, why was the first letter of the Torah a bet? Why does God create a bet? Because the bet is only open going forward. It's closed on the top, it's closed on the bottom, it's closed going back, meaning the only thing you should be focusing on is what's the task at hand. What does the world need from you now? So once they realize that Alexander isn't just asking random questions, he's in fact trying to engage them in a symposium, then they shut him down. They won't do it. Okay, but now this is a dicey thing, because I just want to remind you that Alexander is the conqueror of the known world. And conquerors of the known world are not used to having clergy say no to them. Right? That's not generally done. Were you asking a question or scratching your neck?
So earlier you spoke about the fact that they didn't answer the great scripture didn't mean
Right.
yet in this paragraph they do.
Indeed they do. Because that's the only way to know the answer. Right? Prior to the astronomical equipment we now have, all thought about creation was pure speculation. So the medievals actually doped out a lot about creation, because with speculation you can figure out a lot. Right? So the debate among the medievals is time a created thing? Meaning, did creation begin with the creation of time, or is there eternity and then things unfold within that? Physicists are divided on that subject to this day. Is this the only world, or were there multiple worlds beforehand? The medievals don't really have consensus on that. Neither do contemporary physics. But what contemporary physicists and cosmologists have that they didn't was data. They have no data. And if you don't have data, all you can use is scripture. So that's why for these questions they go back to scripture. Yes?
So from the beginning of your talk, I wondered, are the elders and the sages, are they in the belief that although he is a conqueror, a military conqueror, that in fact Alexander is not so bright? Are they in some way insulting him, surreptitiously perhaps, by choosing not to answer, or not necessarily not to answer his questions, but not to answer in the first instance where they use scripture to which he won't relate? Then they're going to speak to him in a way that, he's not
So
going to get.
the answer is they are intending to insult Alexander, but it's not because they don't think he's bright. It's because they don't think he's good. Right? Alexander is a fool who has relied on power to distract himself from his own humanity. It turns out that's everyone's struggle, isn't it? Right? And the other thing I need to remind you is, again, this isn't a story involving Alexander. This is a story to teach us. Right? So we're meant to learn a lesson from this story. He's just the tool for that story.
Well, I'd like to know why you couldn't think about this as people have always wondered how the world works and where things are. So, in those days, people didn't know what darkness was caused by. They didn't know about distances, so they're asking, tell me about my world. Where are things?
Okay, so two thoughts.
Define what you mean by darkness. I think they're scientific questions.
They are scientific questions. They're just not prepared to have that discussion with Alexander. They're not going to have an abstract discussion with him, and it's an abstract scientific question. It's not a how do I light up my house. It's tell me about the nature of darkness, and in fact the ancients had lots of things to say about the nature of darkness. Is darkness something, or is it merely the absence of light? There's extensive Jewish and Gentile literature on that. Yes, but we're going to have to get through this whole story, so. Ether's way later.
I know, but it was an idea. What is it composed of? And someone said, it's an answer, a practical answer.
Well, it's an answer, but it's not practical. Okay, so now Alexander tries to ask another question, since they wouldn't answer that question. He says, who is wise? And they answer him, one who discerns what is about to come to pass. Now here's just a random Jewish question. If you were to try to think of a rabbinic quote that starts with who is wise, do you know a different answer to that question from the rabbis? Will you share it with us? Yes, sir.
He who is content with what he has.
Nope. Close, same paragraph. That's who's happy.
It's the one who learns from all people.
One who learns from all people. Now that happens to be from Pirkei Avot. And we know that they know that because the next quote they're going to do is from that very paragraph in Pirkei Avot. So why are they going out of their ways to give him an answer other than who is wise, someone who learns from all people? What's Alexander in the process of trying to do? He's trying to learn from all people. And there's no way in the world, so he's fishing for a compliment. Right? And there's no way that they're going to say something nice about him. So they go out of their way to find another rabbinic answer to that question, one which is to say, well, whoever's wise, it's not you. Right? So the definition of wise is someone who can discern what's about to come to pass. Can Alexander discern what's about to come to pass? No, he can't. So this is just a way of saying, not you, buddy. Right? Okay, so then he asks another question. Who is mighty? What's the answer to who is mighty? Someone who is not, which is to say, what's the rabbinic answer? Ezehu Gibur? kovesh et yitzro, one who conquers his own evil impulse. Now that happens to be from the same paragraph as the answer they didn't give him, which is letting the audience know they knew the answer that he wanted. They just weren't going to give it to him, right? And why, though, do they now flip back to the Pirkei Avot, right? One who conquers his impulse. Why are they willing to say that to Alexander? Because he's made a career out of not conquering his evil impulse. He's made a career out of indulging his evil impulse. The man didn't have a yearning that he didn't immediately satisfy, right? So, which is a little enviable, but nonetheless, okay. So then they ask him, who is rich, right? Now, what answer is he expecting to be told? Correct, but what answer is Alexander expecting from them? He's expecting them to say, you're the richest Greek until Aristotle Onassis, man. Right? You've conquered the whole world. You're incredibly rich. You've got everything from Greece to India. Right? So he's giving them another opportunity to praise him, which, by the way, if you're ever in the presence of monarchy, that's the kind of thing they like to talk about. But enough about my talking about me. Let's you talk about me. So they won't give him that. They answer, who Ezehu Ashir, who is rich? Hasamech Bechelko, people who are contented. Oh my God, if there's any description that does not apply to Alexander, that's the one. Right? So they're insulting him yet again. And he says, what should a person do in order to thrive, in order to live? And they answer, he should mortify himself. Right? It's only by mortifying yourself, for Freudians, that's to sublimate oneself. Right? That's what allows you to live fully. And what does it take to mortify yourself? He should keep himself alive. Right? All of these answers, insults to poor Alexander, who's getting more and more aggravated by the moment. What should a person do to make himself popular? And they say, let him hate sovereignty and authority. Isn't that great? Well, they're literary characters, so they're not that brave. But yes, the characters are being portrayed as pretty darn brave. But I also want to point out something here. This is the only exchange where he is given the last word. So I'm going to read it to you, and then I'm going to ask you, why is the author of this story doing that? He says to them, I have a better answer than the one you gave. I say, let the person love sovereignty and authority and use it to confer benefit on mankind. Now notice what the answers are. He says, who is beloved? And they say, not someone who engages in power, which it turns out is the classical rabbinic response to political and military power. Right? During the Bar Kokhba revolt, in which the Jewish armies rebelled against the Romans, the rabbis opposed Bar Kokhba. Right? You should recognize what an enormous revolution Zionism is in Jewish civilization. The mainstream Jewish answer to power and strength was leave it to the Gentiles. Right? We'll pray, we'll do mitzvahs, that will protect us. Leave military stuff to the non-Jews. And Zionism is, no, I think we're going to now try holding the other end of the gun for a while, thank you very much. Right? But that's a rebellion against rabbinic authority. The first Zionist generations are anti-religious. They are attempting to replace Judaism with Zionism. Right? The rhetoric we now use that, you can't be Jewish without being Zionist would have been bizarre to the early rabbis and bizarre to the early Zionists, right? Who, in fact, were attempting to do just that. But now here's the only place where the Talmud allows Alexander to answer back, which means someone writing this story doesn't like the rabbinic answer. Right? It's a really amazing little piece of early anti-rabbinic rebellion stuck in the Talmud. Right? No, don't just reject power, use it to benefit people. And there's no rebuttal to that. We just move on. So I want you to just see that this is within the Talmud, some anonymous storyteller rejecting the rabbinic consensus. So it's an amazing thing. Yeah.
Is that a repetition then that there will be some
Yes.
And it's an adjournment to them, if you're going to be in power.
Correct. And it also means we're not well advised to avoid power. Right? Because if good people avoid power, then you're going to be stuck with bad people exercising power. So good people need to be engaged. I will just point out along those lines that this last election was determined by 25% of the electorate. Right? And whether you're happy with the outcome or not, that's not what I'm quibbling with. What a disgrace to American democracy that, our ancestors would have died for the right to determine their own governance, and Americans can't be bothered. Right? It is a disgrace. Okay, next question. Is it better to dwell on sea or on dry? And they tell him it's better to be on dry land because those who set out to sea are never free from anxiety until they reach dry land again. How is this an insult to Alexander? Because he spent his whole life traveling around conquering new places, right? So they're telling him again, the medieval maps used to call the land terra firma, right? Because the more firma, the less terra. Sorry, I don't often get to do that. And that, just a minute, that is no worse than the jokes your rabbi tells, so don't. No, this is not really about Alexander. This is a piece of literature. Exactly. We are like this. Ready? Okay. So they've dissed him yet again, and he says to them, "Who among you is the wisest?" And they answer, "We're all equal, because we have all concurred in the answers to your question." Now, how is that answer a resistance to Alexander? Yeah.
He can't single out one person for persecution.
Not just persecution. Alexander has built an entire political system on the supremacy of one individual, right? Aristotle has a dictatorship, right? He is a dictator. That's a Greek word, right? He's a tyrant, right? And so the notion that you have one extraordinary human being who gets to be the tyrant and then everyone else just does what he wants, the rabbis are rejecting that entire approach. No, we work on consensus here. None of us are greater than the other. We all do everything together. So it's another insult and rejection to Alexander, and he finally gets so frustrated, he says, "Why do you resist me?" And they answer, "Satan is too powerful." Now that's an interesting answer. What are they doing here? They're not calling Alexander Satan. Don't think that. That's not right. The rabbis are here being polite. Right? This is Milah Shel Shabbat stuff. Right? So the rabbis don't want to be rude and say, "You are too powerful," because that's rude. So they say and said, "Hasatan is too powerful," but what they mean by that is you, Alexander, are too powerful, and anyone who knows how the Talmud talks would know that that's what they're saying. Right? Again, evidence that this isn't directed at Alexander, this is directed at us. Okay, so he says, "I could have you all killed. Right? Stop annoying me." And they respond, "You might have the power to do it, but it wouldn't be a kingly thing for you to do." This reminds me, some of you may recall this. You remember when Ronald Reagan was considering whether or not to visit Bitburg? Remember? German cemetery where SS men were buried. And he was under a lot of pressure both directions. Apparently geopolitically we were supposed to do it, and there were a lot of us who were objecting to it on obvious grounds. And Elie Wiesel, in the White House on national television, said, "Mr. President, that is not your place. You should not go." And I was struck by the fact that the most popular president since FDR, the most powerful man in the world, was being chewed out by a guy who didn't have a single soldier standing behind him. Right? That's kind of what the rabbis are doing here. This is a truth to power moment. Yep, you have the power to kill us, you just don't have the power to silence us. All right, we're going to say what we're going to say until you decide to kill us. We're not going to shut up. So immediately, and this is, by the way, the next sentence is one of the ways you know this is fiction. He was so impressed with them that he clothed them in garments of purple and put chains of gold on their necks. This story also gives you an indication of how rabbis like to be honored. Just pointing that out, you know.
Why did you say light?
I have the mic right now. You leave the humor to me, okay? All right, now we shift stories. He realizes he's not going to be able to get any answers from these guys. They're not going to engage him in conversation. So instead, he says to them, I want to go to the country of Africa. For those of you who are interested, by the way, take a look in the Aramaic above. Amar lahen, ba'ina de Izel le Medina Afriki. Right, it turns out the ancient Aramaic word for Africa is Africa. How cool is that? So I want to go to Africa, he says. And they, being Jewish, they don't tell him how to go to Africa. They start to worry that he might get hurt. You can't get there because the mountains of darkness are in the way, they say. Right? This is just like kind of, it's Jewish shtick here, right? I mean, you could just easily see someone doing this. You know, Bubala, don't go to Africa, you'll hurt yourself, you'll get lost, you know. And so Alexander responds like a Greek king by saying, you know, and don't forget, Alexander never had a Jewish mother, so he's unfamiliar with this kind of response, right? He's used to people answering his questions by telling him what he wants to know. So he says, how do I get there? He expects people to tell him. And so he says to them, you're not going to stop me from going, and that isn't what I asked you. Tell me what I'm supposed to do to get there. Right? This is not an invitation for offering your opinion. This is an invitation for you to tell me what I need to know. So they say, take Libyan donkeys that can travel in the dark. I didn't know Libyan donkeys could do that. And take coils of rope and fix them at the side of the road so that when you return, you can guide yourself by them and reach your destination. All right, extra credit. Tell me the ancient story about someone who wanted to go to a dangerous place, and he used rope, which he unraveled along the way so that he would be able to figure out how to get back. Perseus. Yeah, right? This is the story of the Minotaur, right? When he went into the maze of the Minotaur, Ulysses had other good adventures. When he went into the maze of the Minotaur, he unfurled rope. The rabbis know Greek legends, right? They are citizens of the Hellenistic world, and so they're playing with that trope. Notice also, by the way, this is standard rabbinic assumption for the rabbis and frankly for all of the Eastern Mediterranean. Africa is a great big unknown. They have no notion of what's there. They think it's their symbol for a place that has no culture, that has no tradition. Right? That's their ignorance, but that is their commonness. That was true in Greek literature, in Roman literature, in Egyptian literature, and in Jewish literature. Africa is the place where there's no tradition whatsoever. Okay? Sorry. I didn't write this stuff. I'm just... No, I think they mean, this is not metaphorical darkness. It's like, you know, for those of you who have seen any of the Hobbit movies, you know, the mountain is literally dark. Okay, so he goes to do what they told him to do. He gets those donkeys, he marches into Africa, and he finally comes to a place where there are only women, which I simply want to point out for Alexander is a complete waste. I'm not judging, I'm just pointing out. So he goes to a village, and it's a village of all women. And since he can't do the other thing with them, there's really only two other things left. So he said, let's make war. Well, he could do one other thing with them, which he's going to do when they refuse to make war with him, but he can't have sex with them, or he could, but why bother? So he says to them, let's make war, and they say, nothing doing. We're not going to make war with you because you can only lose. If you kill us, they'll just say he's the guy who killed a bunch of women. And if we kill you, then they'll say he's the guy who got killed by a bunch of women. Either way, you're going to look bad. So, no, we won't do that. Now, I want to point out a couple things. Alexander the Great is in rabbinic literature what Napoleon is in modern Jewish literature, which is to say, Jewish households in Europe all had a portrait of Napoleon on the wall. We loved Napoleon, right? We hate the 1812 overture because that's the bad guys winning, right? We don't like tsars. The tsars are terrible to us. Everywhere Napoleon's armies went, they emancipated the Jews. So Napoleon was a hero for us in ways that modern Jews can't imagine. Right? And Alexander in the Talmud is exactly that kind of hero. Everywhere he went, he spread Hellenistic culture, which for the rabbis was rabbinic culture. So for them, he is a great hero. So you have the most prominent Gentile and the biggest Gentile hero of the rabbinic imagination, and then he meets these women who aren't even given a name. Like, we never learn their names. Africa is viewed as the most barbaric and primitive place. And among Africans, the most lowly people are the women. So he goes, this great goy, that's how you translate goy gadol, right? No extra charge for that, and see, that's funny. So you have the world's most beloved and famous Gentile, and then you have the bottom of the barrel of humanity. All right? These nobodies, these black African women who don't even get a name. And what's brilliant about this story, it's most likely written by a Jewish man, and he makes the women the ones who teach wisdom, not Alexander. This is a radical story. You're welcome. I'm Brad Artson, and I endorse that message. So he can't have sex with them because he's not interested. There are no men around. He can't make war with them because they won't. So there's only one other thing you can use women for. So he says, bring me food. And here comes the lesson. They say to him, they bring him gold bread on a gold table. It's brilliant. Really, it's just brilliant. And whoever wrote this story really gets women, right? When the rabbis want to teach Alexander the lesson that there's no place like home, like if you're not content at home, going somewhere isn't going to change that. Right? They talk at him, blah, 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 blah. Right? That's what men do when they want to make lessons. And if they don't think you heard it the first time, they just say it again, and then they say it again, and then they give a sermon. Right? And it's a very ineffective way of teaching a lesson. But the women, when they teach a lesson, they create the interaction that allows Alexander to figure it out. So he says, I want food. They bring him an ornate, beautiful, lavish gold table with a gold challah. And the guy says, I can't eat that. That's solid gold. I'm hungry. And their response is, he says, do people here eat gold? Like, what are you doing? And they say, if you wanted bread, didn't you have that in the place you started out from? Right? Real nourishment is back home. You don't need to conquer the world to be nourished. You don't need to look around the next conquest for nourishment. What you need to do is notice what you already have. And until you can notice what you already have, you will always be missing something, always looking for the next thing. And he gets it. When he leaves the place, he wrote on the gate of the city, I, Alexander of Macedon, was a fool until I came to the city of women in Africa, and I learned wisdom from the women. Is that amazing? This is the Talmud, right? This is a book that the men wrote for the boys, right? And in the middle of that is this radical story about wisdom often comes from the very people you're looking down at. The very people you've decided can't possibly teach you something, they are exactly the ones who know something you desperately need to know. And your pursuit of power and status and money, that's a sickness, right? If you're hungry, there's bread at home, so stay home. And he acknowledges that. He puts that up, and notice for the first time, he calls himself Alexander of a particular place. He's now, for the first time, of Macedon. Okay, and then I just want to do the next paragraph and then we'll stop, but it's a great conclusion. So as he's walking along the way, he comes up to a well and he decides to eat. And he had packed along some salted fish, and as he washed them, they turned sweet. You all know that in archaic English, sweet doesn't mean sugary, it means the opposite of salty. Right? So this is magical water. You wash the fish in it, and the fish stops being salty. Right? And so he realizes that this is no ordinary spring of water. This is water that flows out of the Garden of Eden, right? Mentioned in the book of Genesis. Okay? So he decides, because now all of a sudden he forgets the lesson that he learned, right? The lesson that whatever you need is already at home is a lesson we learn and forget, and relearn and forget. And we spend our whole lives having to relearn that lesson again and again. So he's already forgotten it. He says, oh my goodness, this spring comes from the Garden of Eden. I can be the first guy to take the Garden of Eden. So he follows the water back until he comes to the Garden of Eden. Some say he took some of the water and washed his face with it. Others say that he went alongside of it until he finally came to the door at the Garden of Eden. So, you know, there's a wall outside the garden. There's an angel with a fiery sword. You're not allowed back in. That's the point. Right? But he's Alexander, and so he figures he's entitled. So he says, open the door for me. And they answer, Ze hashar ladonai. What does that answer mean? This is the gate of the Lord. What are they telling him? How do you know it's not for you? How does that verse continue? Ze hashar ladonai tzadikim yavo'u vo. Only the righteous shall enter. So what is this anonymous voice telling him? You're not a tzaddik, buddy. Right? He's back to getting insulted. Right? So they won't let him in, although they're too polite to quote the verse in full. They just quote the beginning, and they assume he knows the whole pasuk. He can figure out how this is an insult. And he gets annoyed, and he says, I'm a king, meaning you're not supposed to say no to me. I'm a king. I am of some account. Give me something. So they give him a single eyeball. And he went and he put all of his silver and gold on one side of the scale, and he put the eyeball on the other side of the scale, and the eyeball is heavier than all the gold and all the silver. Right? This, by the way, is also common in ancient Near Eastern literature. And he marvels at this. How could this be? And he said to the rabbis who suddenly appear on stage, how is this possible? And they say, it's a human eyeball. And the human eyeball is never satisfied. Once you see it, you want it. Right? And to prove that, they said, take some dust and cover the eyeball. And the minute he did, the gold and the silver outweighed the eyeball. And that's how the story ends. The netherworld and destruction are never satiated, and so too the eyes of man. which is what this story is about. It's about the nature of human beings to always be yearning for something additional. Right? You want a house until you have a house. Then you want a newer house or a bigger house or a house in a different neighborhood or a cul-de-sac. And you want a car until you have a car. And then once you have a car, you want a fancier car or a bigger car or a newer car. Right? And that goes on in every area of your life. And the only way to have satisfaction is to get off the train. Right? You're never going to satisfy it by getting the bigger, newer, whatever. The only way to be satisfied is to be satisfied. Right? And that's the story that Alexander is taught 3 times now. He's taught once by the sages, and he doesn't listen. He's taught once by the anonymous women warriors of Africa, and he gets it for a minute. And then he's taught it by the anonymous them at the Garden of Eden. Them could be the angels, them could be the sages, maybe it's still the women from Africa. We're never told who they are, but we are being taught this story. Right? And the reason I'm sharing it with you, it's my favorite story in the Talmud. Right? I just think it's colossal that they make the heroes of the story these anonymous black women. Right? But I also want to teach you this story because this is all of our struggle. You will never buy your way to contentment. You will never date your way to contentment. You will never own your way to contentment. The only way to achieve contentment is to be content. And that's what you need to work on. That's what Judaism is all about. That's what Western wisdom is all about. That's what Eastern wisdom is all about. It all boils down to this. If you seek contentment, the only way to be content is to be content. I will close with the following Uganda story. So we were finishing up our trip in Uganda, the rabbi, me, a peckle of other rabbis, and we finished up staying at a beautiful hotel in Kampala, which is the capital city of Uganda. And we had come in 2 different cars somehow. So I had my luggage, I was getting it ready, and I saw that everyone else pulled up in another car. So I said to the bellhop, would you mind if I leave my suitcase here? And he said, hakuna matata. And I thought, how does he know I'm from Los Angeles, and why is he making fun of Disney? And then I realized that he said hakuna matata because they actually say hakuna matata. It's not just Lion King. Right? And the wisdom of hakuna matata is it's not a denial of what's real. It's a choice of how you're going to live with what's real. And if you choose to live hakuna matata, then you suddenly enter this space in which you have everything you need. You're okay. You change the narrative, not the facts. So here's a hakuna matata story from the Talmud. Thank you very much for the chance to learn together.
So, well, it's 3 hours late, and I did mention that
That means he's going to tell a joke.
What does hakuna matata mean?
You really want me to sing this to you? Hakuna matata means no worries.
So I mentioned now twice that Rabbi Artson would take some questions. So I don't want to make myself into a liar, because that would not be good. So he will take a couple of questions. But I do want you to know, for the numbers of you that have asked me about process theology, and what is process theology, and what is Rabbi Artson's take on a number of theological concepts and ideas. Over lunch, Rabbi Artson mentioned to me that it would be his pleasure to come back here on a weeknight, some point in the next number of months, when you are all, have had the opportunity to purchase his book on process theology. He didn't say that part, I'm saying that part. He never would have made that kind of comment. But his book on process theology, or if you don't want to read the book, although I would certainly recommend it, an article or two that he has written on process theology, which I can give you, he will come back and have that conversation with us. So please pay attention to your e-newsletter, because I will advertise in there one night during the week, sometime in February or March, right, that we will be having that conversation. But so that you don't call me a liar. Are you okay with a few questions? It could be on last night's talk, this morning's talk,
Or anything.
or anything else. Yes.
Okay, so I was here last night also. Last night's was, okay, somebody who was not content where he was and changed. Okay, today's was somebody who was not content. Okay, so you seem to be. We have they're opposed to each other. One said, today was say be content with your lot. Last night was, not.
Don't be content with your lot.
Yeah.
Yes, and what's the problem? No, I'm serious. Look, rabbinic wisdom, unlike Greek wisdom, does not seek to establish eternal truths that are true in all contexts. Right? We don't believe in that approach to life. There are timely truths, not timeless truths. And knowing which is the truth for this moment, that's the key to wisdom. So the Bible is full of all kinds of contradictions, because sometimes in life you need to be told, be content. And sometimes in life you need to be told, don't be content. And so you need a wisdom tradition that contains both of those, and then the key is to know when you need to pull out which one. They are both right in different contexts. Thank you. I know you meant that as a compliment, and that's how I'm taking it. Yes, sir.
I heard this years ago about real-life Alexander. He was good to the Jews and the Judeans when he captured Judea, and so he asked, would you worship me as a god, like the other conquered countries? And they said, no, we can't do that. We can name all our sons this year Alexander, and that's why Alexander became a Jewish name. Even though that's what I heard.
Okay, since there was no question, I won't give an answer.
Well, do you know if that's true?
I do know if that's true. If you mean by that, did that story really happen historically? Not on your life. Not on your life. Everybody made up Alexander stories. I mean, he was the most famous guy, so anyone who wanted to make a point made an Alexander story that taught whatever they wanted to taught. And so, of course, we teach that he was good to us because that shows how special we are. The only problem is there are no Greek Alexander stories about his loving the Jews. Right? There's frankly no stories about him paying any attention to the Jews. He was focusing on Persia and India, right? And we were just in the way, right? So I don't think he actually noticed when he was marching through Judea. He was just trying to move on. So we don't loom large in his imagination, although he looms very large in ours. Just a piece of rabbinic advice. If someone tells you a story that seems unbelievable, it's best to not believe it. Yeah.
So I noticed in this story that there was a lot of allusions to Greek mythology. And like I said, there was Perseus, this King Midas, probably the Isle of Lesbos and the Amazons. So is that specific to this story because they're talking about someone who came out of Greece, or is that very typical of the time?
The authors of the Mishra and the Talmud and the Midrash are part of Hellenistic culture. So there's a common set of stories. I'm not saying they read Greek literature directly, but they knew the stories. Right? They knew aspects of Greek philosophy. When they do a caricature of a Greek philosopher, they nail it. Right? So they're literate members of this broad multicultural community.
Is that part of the idea of trying to transmit your information to a civilization that may not otherwise be receptive to it?
I think what it was more was that Judaism identified itself as a Hellenistic civilization. So in the same way that medieval Judaism identified itself as part of Muslim culture. Right? Never identified itself as part of Christian culture. Right? But Jews in Muslim countries wrote Arabic. Yeah.
Would you like me to mention it in the website?
Okay, so for those of you who would like to listen to some of my podcasts, you can go to ziglartorah.org. The name of the school is Ziglar, the name of the Torah is Torah, and org is because we're organized. So, so you can listen to the podcast. It's an easy way to add hours, and they contain the same kind of irreverent humor with which you have been regaled this past hour. So if you like it, good, and if not, you're warned. Anyone else? Okay. Thank you, everybody.